Hi, thanks for watching. Okay, so in this video, I would like to talk about the current Lori Vallow trial. Okay, she's currently on trial for the murder of her ex-husband, Charles Vallow. Okay, this is going on right now. We're in April 2025. This is going on in Phoenix, Arizona. And I think everybody pretty much agrees that Lori is doing way better than we thought. Okay, acting as her own attorney. Okay, and believe me, like I went to law school. I used to be an attorney. I've been working in criminal defense for a long, long time. Okay, and I can tell you, I don't have the communication skills that Lori Vallow has. Okay, honest to God. I mean, you're either born with it or you're not. I'm not saying she's smarter than I am. I don't think so, but I don't have her communication skills. Okay, she has phenomenal communication skills, and she actually has better attorney skills than a lot of attorneys. Okay, I would say compared to the average attorney out there working in, let's say, criminal litigation. Okay, I would say Lori is probably in the top 5%. Okay, in terms of talent. Now she would need some training to do a better job. She needs training, but in terms of the raw talent and some of the stuff she's getting away with, I would say she's in the top 5%. Okay, easily. Okay, so no need to underestimate Lori. Okay, and we would just be fooling ourselves, and it would be dishonest for us not to acknowledge her phenomenal talent and communication skills. Okay, she's very talented. All right, I'm not saying she's super smart, but she's very talented with communication, and in fact almost to the level of witchcraft. I'll be honest. Okay, and so let's just give it to her. Let's admit that. At the same time, I think all of us can tell, or at least if we're honest, I think we can feel there's something off with Lori, regardless of her communication skills, regardless of her talent. I think we can all feel there's something a little wrong with her. And I think we can all kind of tell that it's something on the order of a mental illness. Okay. Exactly what that mental illness is, I think it would be very naive for us just to put her in a simple basket of being a psychopath or a simple basket of a simple personality disorder. I think there's too many factors with her religious background. And maybe even if she were to have a personality disorder, I think it's a complex personality disorder and not a simple personality disorder. And so I think it's better for us just to leave the labels aside and just to analyze it fresh without any preconceived notions. So in terms of analyzing how well Lori's doing in terms of her acting as an attorney, okay, if I were to evaluate her, okay, I can't separate the fact that she sort of appears to be a little bit crazy, not psychotic, but she seems a little off mentally. Okay, and that will affect, I think, how the average juror, I think, would sort of take in her case. Okay, but here's the problem. Okay, there's 12 jurors. Okay, and so you always have to ask yourself, could there be one or two jurors that could sympathize with her or sympathize with some of the arguments and maneuvers that she's making in the court? Okay, so if I were to honestly assess how she's doing in terms of her own defense, in terms of a legal analysis, okay, um, I have to include the fact that she doesn't appear to be entirely sober. Okay, she doesn't appear to be entirely sober, and I think in mental health and in law, I think we use the word competent too much, and we use the word like psychotic, crazy. We use all that too much, and I don't think we use the word sober enough. Okay, sober to me is really the test. Okay, a person can appear to be sort of competent, and they can sort of seem to have good functioning of the brain, but if they don't appear to be overall sober, okay, and I think sober really is the most important word. I think it's an underused word. Okay, so when someone doesn't appear entirely sober, I think at least for the majority of jurors, okay, it's going to be hard to really believe in them and really take them seriously, or to give them that full credibility to really win a case. Okay, so I would say at least for 90% of jurors, I would say that the weakness that Lori's going to have, regardless of her communication skills, okay, is that she does come across to me not as flat out crazy, but she seems to be, there's something wrong with her. She doesn't seem to me to be entirely sober. Lori does not come across to me as an entirely sober person. Okay, so that, at least if I were a juror, I would have trouble really trusting her. Okay. And in fact, she might even be really harming her case. Okay. The problem is, if we're going to be honest, okay, whenever you're dealing with a jury trial, okay, you have to be worried about that 5 or 10% of jurors that could potentially hang the jury. So, moving away from a strictly legal analysis of what Lori is doing here, if we kind of pan out in a more general sense, I think we have two basic questions in this case. Okay, number one, is there a chance that Lori could succeed in getting a hung jury? Okay, not winning, but getting a hung jury. Okay, that's number one. That's the first question. I think the second question is the question that's been nagging us all this time. What really happened? Okay, how did Charles Vallow really die? I think we all kind of know, but I mean, we can still ask the question: how did he really die? How was his death orchestrated? And I think we all know it was orchestrated to some extent. Okay, and then finally, what is Lori's real mental condition? Okay, without putting her in a box, I don't want to put her in a specific box, but what is her mental condition, or what is her profile? And basically that never ending question for us, which is, does she really believe, does she really believe in her position? She seems not to have any doubt. She seems so confident, and I know that a con artist, that's how they win, by being so confident. But does she cross that line in her delusions to where she's more than just a con artist, where she's so confident because she's not conning us, but because she's conning herself? Or how fully does she actually believe in her world and her position and her righteousness? So I think those are the main questions. Okay, so first I'd like to talk about the serious immediate question, which is, what are the chances of an actual hung jury in this case? Okay, legally speaking, and from my experience working in criminal defense, okay, a self-defense case, or something that appears to be a self-defense case, can be very difficult, okay, to prosecute. Okay, can be very difficult to prosecute. Okay, and so here's the problem. Okay, if you look back to Lori's family and her family dynamics with Alex, okay, when Alex comes to her side, I think they get very creative, and I think they're very tactical, and they're very uncanny in the way they work together. And I don't think, between Lori and Alex, I don't think they had to be too explicit verbally to plan something. I think they have enough tribal, call it like tribal empathy or tribal cohesion, that I think they could get away with a lot of nonverbal communication, or a lot of kind of innuendo communication. Okay, so I don't think Lori had to set up like a game plan, like a football play, and set up, you're going to be here with the bat, you're going to be there with the gun, you're going to do this, you're going to do that. I don't think it was necessary in that family dynamic. I think she could be a little more in the innuendo, using her Bible verses and making Alex feel inspired, and just enough to know that it was enough for Alex to hate Charles, or to think that Charles had become evil, and that Charles was attacking Lori not just as a person, but he was actually now attacking Lori as a Mormon. Okay, and he was trying to take away her temple recommend, and really attacking her at a very, very special place that's not only important for Lori, but also her family background. Remember, Charles was a convert to Mormonism, okay, but Lori was born into it. And I think she came from a family that is of that strain of Mormonism, where they're so proud, even to the point where they could even conceive of defending themselves physically to protect their religious identity. Okay. And I don't think Charles appreciated what he was getting into as he began escalating with Lori, because I think Lori and her family, they are very escalatory. Okay. And if you're going to get in a contest of escalation with a pair like Lori and Alex, I think most people are not going to win that contest. Okay. Unless they are also either very talented or very prepared. Okay. So basically, because there was an escalation going on, and because there was an attack on their religious identity, okay, very serious attack on Lori's religious identity, I think the family dynamics, especially with Alex, are going to move towards protecting Lori with the fierceness of their ancestral inheritance, their kind of ancestral instincts, that have to do with a lot about the history of Mormonism. And I think it's kind of hard to verbalize it, but I just think there's a lot of ancestral material that's going to come up and be very powerful. Okay. And so I don't think that Lori had to be explicit with Alex. I don't think she had to like map out the exact plan. But I think probably what she could do is she could probably tell both Alex and Tylee, hey, I think there's going to be a fight here. Maybe she didn't have to tell Tyler, hey, come out with your baseball bat, but she might have said something to Tyler like, well, at least you have your baseball bat if anything gets crazy, innuendo. I think Lori is clever enough that she would operate through innuendo. Okay, so let's get that out of the way. And I think that Tylee was probably not given specific instructions, but she was probably reminded that she had a baseball bat to protect herself. But I think with Alex, I think it was enough for Lori to convince Alex that Charles had gone bad. Okay, that was number one. She had to convince and convey to Alex that Charles was the enemy for them, not just as people, but in the terms of their religious identity, very precious for that family. Okay, for the Cox family. Okay, so I think Alex was convinced that Charles was a threat to their religious identity and to their religious pride, I guess, and to their status as Mormons. Okay, so I think she achieved that, number one. She achieved having not just Alex, but other people in her family believe that Charles had become an enemy in something related to their religious identity. That was number one. Number two, I think she evoked Alex's instinct to want to protect his sister. Okay, I don't think she had to say specifically, let's kill him. Although you could argue that in the religious sense, they had already gone into the fantasy that Charles was not really fully human, that he was, let's say, possessed by evil spirits, and they could probably play games with that, but I don't think that adds up to conspiracy to commit murder. Okay, because that you can argue that that's just a lot of religious talk, and not to be taken literally, or they can just play with all the, whenever you get into the religious world where people are now zombies and you're talking about, relieving them of their evil spirit and releasing the body, that becomes so metaphorical in a sense that I don't think it'll always pass in a court of law as a hardcore plan to kill somebody. Okay, although debatable, but still, we're in the world of reasonable doubt. We're in the world of trying to predict if somebody could actually hang the jury. So we're not worried about the majority, 90% of the jurors. We're worried about that terrible 1% of jurors or 10% of jurors that's going to cause a problem. So in that sense, I think if you're going to hang your case on religious innuendo, I think I would see that as risky. Okay. So I'm just leaving room for the fact that maybe what Lori did with Alex was, number one, convince him that Charles is the enemy. Number two, sort of implant Alex with the idea that she needed protection. Alex is only too eager. And so Alex very easily gets infected by the desire to vanquish and destroy people that attack his sister, because I don't think it's just his sister, but I think there's that tribal identity that my sister is a precious Mormon. I think the Mormonism does play into it. And I think Alex very easily gets motivated to protect his sister with almost like an ancestral instinct. Okay. So I think it is very complicated. And I think in that context, it was not necessary for Lori to be super explicit. Okay. I think it was clear enough that Alex wanted to defend her, and maybe they had it on the table. Hey, look, they might have even conned themselves by saying, hey, look, if it gets too bad, I am in my rights to protect you with lethal force, and so now there's another question, if they're planning a situation where a fight is expected, okay, and basically they plan together that if it gets bad enough that Alex is prepared to use lethal force to protect her if it gets bad enough. You see, is that really premeditated murder, or are they just planning? Are they planning for what'll happen if they need to escalate to lethal force to protect Lori? In other words, you have to see it through the point of view of deluded minds. Okay, even though they are essentially provoking a self-defense situation. Okay, what they can turn it around and they can say it in a way that doesn't sound like they're just planning just to assassinate the guy. And they can basically say, hey, look, we're expecting a big fight. If it gets really bad, I'm your brother. He's a bad guy. He doesn't have good intentions. If he gets too aggressive, I will protect you. Planning self-defense is not the same thing as saying, hey, we'll make it look like self-defense. Okay. They're not being that, how would you say, they're sort of conning themselves a little bit, So I don't know that if you really play back the tapes and if you could really see what went on between Lori and Alex, I don't know if they said, hey, look, we're just going to kill this guy. Okay. Now, they may have said that in a religious language, okay? But in the religious language, I don't think that's enough to hang a case to get over, like, say, the risk of a hung jury. Okay, so I think there's at least the possibility that what they had set up was, let's be prepared in case this goes bad, and I will protect you with deadly force if necessary. Okay, so I think in that sense, I think Lori was fully prepared to provoke an escalation with Charles. She was fully prepared to provoke an escalation. I think she had forewarned both Tylee and Alex that it was going to turn into a fight. I think she planned on provoking it. Okay, but I think they had rationalized to themselves that, if Charles gets out of control, we will do what we need to protect Lori. Okay, so, and also let's analyze this very carefully. Even though Lori took the phone, that's not enough to justify, let's say, Charles getting too aggressive. Okay, so in all honesty, okay, if Charles knew that this was a highly charged, provocative kind of family, really bad family blood, a situation of very bad family blood, and Charles knowing that Lori was in a very hostile position, okay, I think if you could play it back, I think Charles would probably have not chosen to get so upset at Lori for taking the phone. I'm not saying to blame Charles. I'm just saying Charles sort of fell into the trap. You see, because Charles then became, you might say, the real escalator. Okay, what Lori did was annoying. It was kind of like a prank. It was kind of like witchcraft kind of shit. But what Charles did was actually raise it to like screaming, maybe raising the voice, maybe getting kind of aggressive. And I think he kind of lost the chess game, you might say. I think a smarter person in that situation would have said, okay, this looks like a trap. He even said it was a trap. He even said they were planning something before he even went into the house. Okay, so I think if he was maybe smarter, he would have said, okay, this is an ambush situation, and just gotten the hell out of there, just gotten out, and would have gone maybe to the police to recover his telephone. Okay, so I think Charles did fall into the trap. I think this was a highly charged family, a lot of family dynamics here, and I think Charles probably fell into the trap of, Lori provoked him. Okay, and I think once he got kind of aggressive, I think Tylee came out, probably did bring the bat out. Maybe Charles did grab the bat, and at that point, how many times have police shot somebody on the street because they don't put down a knife or a bat or whatever, and not even like lunging towards the police? Just having a weapon in your hand. I think you're increasing the chances that you could actually win in court if you actually got challenged, in this self-defense scheme. Okay, so on this question of whether Charles was the first person to escalate the fight, okay, we know that Lori provoked the fight. She provoked it, but who escalated the fight? Okay, so on that question of whether Charles was the escalator, getting into the violent territory, it doesn't mean Charles had to be violent. It just means he had to grab a weapon. If he raised his voice and grabbed a weapon, okay, you're now at least in the territory of escalation, taking it from a provocation to an escalation. Okay, so if that's on the table, all right, then we have to go back to how Lori is performing, acting as a defense, and in her own defense, acting as her own attorney. Okay, so in that sense, she is doing one thing very well. Okay, and I don't think she's getting enough credit. I mean, I don't want to give her credit. Okay, but in all honesty, I think we have to give her credit. She's doing something very rare and kind of unusual that even a lot of attorneys are not going to get away with. Okay, and this is sort of like the high level of litigation, the high level of trial practice. Okay, which is, it's kind of like basketball, or kind of, I guess, basketball. You can't win in basketball if you don't know how to foul. Okay, you have to know how to foul. Okay, the same thing in trial practice. Okay, you have to ask questions that are improper, and you have to elicit objections. You have to get shot down with objections, because even though the judge will actually sustain the objection, okay, the jury still hears stuff. Okay, and even though the judge says sustain, the jury still hears things. Okay, and the jury notices when the prosecutor gets really upset at certain questions. Okay, so what is Lori doing? She's smearing Charles, okay, in her questions. She's raising issues so that she doesn't have to testify. Okay, so she's essentially testifying by asking questions. In other words, she's getting real close to waiving her Fifth Amendment right not to testify. Okay, and she's getting a lot of free testimony. Okay, and it's all getting shot down with objections, but the jury still hears it, and the jury is now, not the whole jury, but that terrible 10% of the jurors, that one or two jurors, the scary jurors, the ones that could hang the jury, they're now hearing things like, oh shoot, Was Charles taking steroids? Was he dating so many girls that maybe he was a raving maniac and really aggressive? Is it possible that Charles was maybe having a midlife crisis, taking steroids, getting so aggressive and going out with girls left and right, being kind of quick to anger, all of those things actually add favor, that they actually help Lori's case, because all we have to prove, if you believe that police are okay and police get away with it all the time, some criminal has a baseball bat, the cops say drop the bat, and they don't, and they shoot him on the street, they get away with it. The same thing in this family. As soon, even though they may have planned the ambush, even though Lori may have planned this whole situation, as soon as Charles, let's say, if it's even true, I don't know that it's true, but if it is true that Charles actually grabbed the baseball bat, as soon as he grabbed the weapon and was at the same time raising his voice, there is a valid, I think there's a valid risk that the jury could hang here. This could be a hung jury. And so Lori, even though it's totally improper and the judge is shooting her down with all these objections, she's actually getting into the airspace, the idea that Charles may have been pretty aggressive, and it is now raising the issue for at least one or two jurors, possibly, that maybe Charles, made the mistake, of getting a little aggressive. Maybe he fell for Lori's provocation, even though Lori did provoke it. Charles fell for it and he grabbed a bat, and at that point, I'd say there's high risk that one or two jurors could hang the jury. I hope it doesn't happen, but, but the whole point being that let's give credit for Lori. She's doing something that even lawyers aren't very good at. She's intentionally asking improper questions, knowing she's going to get shot down, because on the higher level, in the theatrical reality of the trial, the juror can see when the prosecutor is getting upset, and therefore when the jury can see when the prosecutor is feeling insecure about a part of the case. And there are places where the prosecutor does feel insecure. She doesn't want all that information coming in, that maybe Charles was dating a lot of women, that maybe he was maybe hormonally a little overcharged. That doesn't help the prosecution. And the prosecution, you can tell they feel insecure about that part. Okay, so Lori is actually, I think she's actually performing at a very high level that even a lot of attorneys wouldn't get away with. So got to give her credit for that. And so I think at the point that if it happened the way Lori said, if Charles actually got loud and if he actually did grab a baseball bat from Tylee, I think at that point, I think Charles was in a terrible position, because there's, you're not going to get 12 jurors to agree, but there's always going to be one or two jurors that I think you run the risk where they could say, well, maybe it was self-defense, in the same sense that cops get away with similar things, in everyday street situations. So, I think in all honesty, I would say, cold-headed, honestly, okay, even though Lori does appear to be a little bit kind of crazy, I think she's raising some issues with her defense, where I think maybe one or two jurors could hang the jury, basically on the doubt that even though Lori kind of set it up, even though she set up the fight, I think Charles did do some escalating and probably made the mistake of grabbing a weapon, a bat. If there's even doubt that he grabbed the bat, I think at that point, basically there's room to have doubt, and therefore not to want to convict somebody on the doubt that there have been some self-defense in play. Okay, so I'm not saying the whole jury is gonna acquit. Okay, I'm saying maybe one or two jurors could have that position. You know what I mean? So I would say there's a very high risk of a hung jury. Now, I'm not saying it's going to be a hung jury. Okay, you never know. This is the gamble of a trial, of a jury trial. But I would say, in cold honesty, I would say there's significant risk of a hung jury. Okay, and we'll hope for the best. Obviously, I hope I'm wrong, because I think she is guilty as hell. And I think they did set it up to be self-defense, but I just think they probably used enough innuendo in the way they planned it that you can't say it was, there's room that they set up a situation where it actually did become technically self-defense. And I think, there's reasonable doubt there, in my opinion, so that I think maybe a couple of jurors could hang the jury. Okay, so that's just being honest. Okay, now the next question is the question of, Lori's psychology. I think we always have to go back to that, okay? Because I think this is a very fascinating case. And I think we're always left with the question of, how much does Lori honestly believe, and how much of it is her being either a con artist or crazy, So I think that's the next question. So as I approach the question of what is really going on with Lori mentally, okay, as I approach that question, okay, where am I coming from? Okay, I myself have been diagnosed with a personality disorder. This was when I was a late teenager. Okay, I was diagnosed again when I was in my 30s. That was more than 20 years ago. Okay, I'm in my 50s now, but when I was in my 30s, I was diagnosed again, and I was not diagnosed with the same diagnosis. Okay, so just to be honest, okay, I was actually diagnosed with NPD when I was 18 years old. Okay, that was not re-diagnosed when I was in my 30s, but I still believe that some of it fits. I'm not going to pretend it doesn't fit. But if somebody were to ask me honestly, like, what is my real issue psychologically, I would say my real issue is that I come from an ancestry and I come from a family, not unlike Lori's, okay, where I think we know it if we've been through it. Okay, how many of us have been raised in what we would call dysfunctional families? Okay, dysfunctional environment, kind of like not one specific personality disorder, but just sort of an environment that sort of is in the neighborhood of like personality disorders in general. Okay. How many of us have been raised in families where you could say there's a lot of borderline, there's a lot of kind of narcissism, there's a lot of just really unhealthy, like drug addiction, alcoholism, just violence, fighting, just kind of that rough. I don't know if we didn't have psychology and if we didn't have the vocabulary of psychology, I would just say I was raised in a rough family of rough people that are just very aggressive, very sloppy, kind of sloppy, aggressive, kind of primitive, like primitive people. How many of us have been raised in that, have grown up in that environment? That's home for us, and we are raised in those patterns and those vibrations, that sort of environment. It can affect some people, and I think I am myself very susceptible to that. So um, when I look at Lori, she feels like she comes from kind of the same people. You know what I mean? Not exactly the same. Like, I'm not a Mormon. I was not raised a Mormon, but my father's family, actually, the ancestry, comes from, I think, the same area of New York State. Let's say my family was in New York State before the US was even a country. Okay, so even before the revolution, for at least 100, I think, well, maybe not 100 years, let's say the late 1600s. Okay, my family was already in, let's say, the New York City area. Okay, and then they kind of migrated into central and western New York, and kind of around the same time that Mormonism was arising, sort of in the early 1800s. So I would like to think that in a weird way, like, my family is kind of almost racially, you might say, kind of the same as a lot of people who became the first Mormons. And so I know that we are very rural people. We come from sort of a farming background. Let's say our British ancestry is kind of like the Scotch Irish, kind of the rough people, the kind of people that fight a lot, that are not afraid of a fist fight, people that get drunk, people that have tempers, that have spectacular anger, and spectacular family dynamics. So I would say, on average, I would say my family is probably a little rougher than the average Mormon. I think the Mormons are actually kind of upper crust. I think in back in those days, because the religion was sort of like a Scientology, so you had to be kind of high IQ, I think, to sort of catch on to that religion. I don't think that was a religion for kind of dumb people. So my family is probably like a little bit lower than the people that would become the Mormons. But I'd like to think that I can sort of relate to, I think, some of the vibrations I'm picking up in Lori. And I think Lori does actually stand out from the rest of her brothers. I think Lori and Alex, I think they kind of stood out. I think the rest of the siblings, they seem a little more normal. But I think Lori and Alex, they kind of have that extra edge, that pirate vibe. When you're around people that feel like they could be pirates, kind of a little spectacular in their anger, and a little bit unsober in their way of thinking. So I can kind of relate to that. Okay, so when you know I cannot approach Lori through normal psychological terminology and vocabulary, because I myself have lived through this stuff. And I know personally that rarely do you find people that fit into one box of a personality disorder. Okay, I think if you want to, like with a lot of people, you can find some psychopathic characteristics in Lori, for sure, no doubt. She has some psychopathic characteristics. Okay, but I am confident that a lot of psychologists would not diagnose her as antisocial. They would not diagnose her because she probably doesn't have all of the elements to formalize that diagnosis. Okay, so at least you could at least find some psychologists that would not agree to that. Okay, and I think some psychologists might not even agree that she's fully narcissistic. They might say she has narcissistic characteristics. Okay, so I think in the end, I think it's probably best, especially given the religious background and sort of the ancestral issues. I think it would be best not to put her in a specific box, but I think it is fair to say what is obvious. Okay, coming from my background, okay, and I come from a background of rough people with a lot of spectacular tempers and a lot of alcoholism and addiction and all that crap, dysfunctional world, whatever. Um, I would say what is undoubtable, what is absolutely true about Lori is she is very escalatory. She is an escalator. Okay, so if you're going to try to raise your voice to her, if you're going to try to get aggressive with her, she will escalate and beat you. She is someone who wins. Okay, she escalates and she wins. Okay, she may win to her own detriment. She may win in ways that don't favor her long-term success, but she is someone who will escalate and she won't be bested by people. Okay, or if you're going to beat her, you're going to have to really win. Okay, so Lori so Lori is an escalator. The other thing is Lori is very crafty, very crafty. Okay, if we didn't live in the modern world, okay, if we lived in a more ancient world, we might say that Lori has some witchcraft. Just very uncanny, almost to the point of being almost psychic. She really senses people and just has an uncanny way of sort of getting some dominance on people through. I would almost say almost like witchcraft. Just her ability to use her voice to manipulate. Um, so she's very uncanny, and she's not somebody that from my experience, and this is why I don't understand Charles, because I'm assuming that Charles also came from kind of a similar background, maybe some dysfunctional, stuff, so that maybe he would kind of know by instinct when he's dealing with somebody that you don't want to mess with. Okay. And at least in my case, from my background, I don't have to look at Lori for even 5 minutes before I realize that I would not want to mess with her, because I can feel it. I can feel that she's not somebody that I would want to challenge, especially not in a deep personal way. And so we come to the final question, which is how much is Lori just being a cynical con artist? And how much does she actually believe in her own righteous delusions? Okay, what is it? Or does she even have delusions? Is she just a cold, calculating, cynical liar? Or is there some degree to which she's a little bit deluded or deranged? And how much does she actually believe in her righteousness? Okay, and I think personally, I don't think a psychologist can answer this question as well as a person who's actually been through this kind of family or this kind of mental experience. Okay. I think in a way, psychologists have a disadvantage that a lot of psychologists do not have experience always in either their own personal pathologies or their own personal, let's say, coming from like super, super dysfunctional families. And that in a way is, I think, that's a disadvantage for the psychologist. Okay, because you have to really kind of understand what it's like to come from, let's say, the pirate ship. You know what I mean? Some people are just not pirates. They're not going to know what it's like to be on a pirate ship. They can only imagine. Just like some people will never know what it's like to really be in a gang. You can study gangs, but if you've never been in a gang, you're not going to understand it like people who've been in the gang. Kind of like that. Okay, so I think I'm going to be honest here. Okay, my father actually, in at times when he was younger. Okay, my father was actually a medical school professor. Okay, so my father was a pretty smart guy, very successful person. Okay, but my father, at times when he would get spectacularly angry and upset, he would lose his sobriety even without drinking. Okay. In other words, when my father would get really like, let's say, if somebody got on my dad's bad side, okay, when my dad was younger, okay, if somebody got on my dad's bad side, my dad's thinking would become very unfair towards that person, and my dad's tactics would become unfair towards that person. Okay. I think we have to understand. I think this is an ancestral thing. I think it's a tribal thing. I think for some people who are kind of aggressive, okay, some people who are aggressive, some people who are escalatory, okay, when the escalation gets aroused, okay, when we get an aroused escalation, I think it can degrade our sobriety, okay, and I think it can also arouse very primitive battle instincts, like combat instincts, where at some point when you start to perceive somebody as an enemy, or when you perceive somebody as a threat, even a family member, okay, it can trigger a very primitive schema. It's like a primitive schema. It's like a primitive operator, okay, where we begin operating with a very degraded sobriety, and where the tactics of winning starts to supersede, like say the importance of being honest or fair, okay. And when we start to morph into this more primitive form, okay, it's almost like a transformation, okay, kind of like an altered state. It's like an altered state. And I think we don't understand well enough today in psychology what it means to transform into an altered state, especially when it's a more primitive state, okay? Because when we become more primitive, this is when, let's say, our instincts toward combat tactics, beating people, winning, let's say vanquishing the enemy, this starts to arouse more, like say, primitive mentality, like a primitive ideation, whatever, where we're no longer thinking like a normal sober person, and we're no longer holding like a balance of all like the basic values of honesty and, like say the etiquette of how you debate somebody and all that kind of goes out the window, because we start transforming into an altered state that is more primitive, okay. And I think in a more primitive state, if we're prone to, like say, combat fighting, if you come from an ancestry where there is that modality of, like say, sometimes having to just beat somebody to beat the enemy, okay, when that starts to take over, I think the derangement and the degradation of sobriety makes it very hard to maintain what we would consider like the normal etiquette of fairness and honesty, okay. And it all happens subconsciously, right? So I think that what we're seeing with Lori is that she degrades into she transforms and degrades into an altered primitive state, where I think what is very prominent in her character, very similar in my family, is she's a fighter. She's a fighter. She's a witch. She's a fighter. She's a witch. She's a manipulator. And when she feels righteous and justified, she will do whatever it takes to do what is necessary to beat the other person. But it is done not through cold sophisticated calculation, but through an altered primitive state, okay. And I think in that altered primitive state, what becomes paramount is beating the person, winning and beating the other person, okay. And so I've seen that with my father. And my father is normally a very sober, very successful academic, professor, basically, my father. But when he would get into his altered state, when he's, let's say, somebody's not on his good side, and my dad's kind of aroused with his, let's say, not liking somebody or whatever, he could be very unfair. But I don't think he was using the same brain he would normally use when he wasn't aroused by that hostility. You see what I mean? So when my dad was in a more normal state, like a professional state, he would have all the etiquette of fairness. He would have all the reasoning, all the balance of honesty. But when my dad would get, like, say, kind of aroused and really not liking somebody, I could see the transformation. And it was clearly a more primitive personality, okay, where a lot of the etiquettes of fairness kind of they sort of recede, and what really becomes dominant is just this kind of more savage, will, this like savage will to win and to beat the enemy, or to beat somebody who deserves what they got coming. So it's a more primitive state. So I think that, in my best estimation, I think Lori has probably kind of gone up and down in her life with a tendency to be a little too aroused by her more primitive aspects, okay, where maybe she might have moments of sobriety, but I think a lot of times when dealing with the normal stress of life, I think Lori gets aroused into a very kind of hypervigilant, sort of a complex PSD, they call it PTSD, kind of an over aroused state, where she's kind of operating on a more primitive level. And I think that brings out more primitive components of her personality, okay, specifically the fighter and the witch, basically. The fighter and the witch, basically. And I think in those states, I don't think you can judge somebody you can't judge someone using the benchmarks you would use for a normal sober person, okay? So I think we have to have a totally different way of assessing somebody when they go into a primitive state, especially when we're asking, are they being honest? Do they truly believe? Okay. I think a lot of Lori's recent beliefs, especially as she approached her, what I think was her midlife crisis before she met, around the time she met Chad Daybell, I think Lori got into a midlife crisis of some sort. I don't think she's come out of it. And I think in that crisis mentality, I think all of her belief systems, all of her reasoning was in a state of what I think would be like degraded sobriety and a kind of derangement because the more primitive parts of her personality sort of took over. Okay, so I don't think we can't assess her we can't assess her in the context of like a normal, sober, healthy person. Okay, so then the question is, well, does she honestly believe? Well, she may honestly believe, but it's with the asterisk that she's honestly believing in a primitive crisis state. Okay, like the state of a crisis, basically. I think somewhere, where she started believing in the end of the world and the end times with all of her Mormon brainwashing, okay, which, there's a lot of brainwashing going in there. I think the combination of brainwashing and the feeling like the world was coming to an end and then having a lot of people dying around her, I think she went into the primitive state. I think that primitive state has now become, this crisis state has now become sort of the dominant aspect of her personality. And I don't think she's not a sober person with normal, she doesn't have normal sobriety and normal, I don't know, like normal. She's not a normal, healthy person to ask the question, does she honestly believe? I think she's in a degraded, deranged state, like a crisis state, and so I don't think the question is really meaningful to ask if she's really being honest. Okay, and I think because we know that she's not really sane, she's in an altered state of some sort. I think it's best not to really hope for an answer or really to ask too much the question of whether she's being honest. She may be honest in a weird way. She may be honest there may be some truth to the fact that she's being honest, but you have to also see the fact that she's in a deranged state. Okay. So, in my opinion, I think it doesn't make any sense to try to tag one specific personality disorder. I think it's just enough to say that Lori has primitive elements in her personality that come out very easily when she's aroused or in a crisis state. Okay. And I think that, around the time she met Chad Daybell, she was getting into crisis. And I think that's pretty much become her personality. And so I think she's just a very primitive person, okay, with very primitive ancestral modalities of like the fighter, the witch, the manipulator, whatever. And I just think that overall, in my opinion, Lori is not a sober person. Okay, she's deranged. I think the word is deranged. I've seen this stuff in my own family. I don't know if that makes her legally insane. But if you were to ask me, does Lori honestly believe? I would say yes, she honestly believes. But I think because she is insane to some extent, I don't think the question is really very meaningful. Okay, and so I would say, yeah, she honestly believes, but she's crazy. And I think crazy is the word. I don't think you need to say psychopathic, because I think it's just a primitive state. That's a way a person could be crazy. And I would say that overall, she's just not a sober person. And if you wanted to put some label on her, I wouldn't say psychopathic. I would say criminally insane. Criminally insane. I know that all of this may not be satisfying, but this is the best I can do. I'm sort of running out of time here, so I appreciate your patience. And thanks for watching. Talk to you later.